So now for 10 years we've been practicing our winemaking skills on these exceptional apples from the south, and now we're getting access to our own fruit up here, and it is very much the next step. And we were at the cider yesterday and you actually tasted it.
One thing I'm really interested to ask you about is your orchard planting project.
Yeah.
I think that's the next level in terms of what you do and how you do it. The method and the process and the place is fascinating, but that is, you know, even richer and deeper. So
yeah. So when I started this, again, I'm a wine person, not an expert, but wine is it's the thing that takes me in terms of alcoholic beverage. So when I started this, I said, okay, we're going to make a sweet wine in northern Sweden, and it's going to be good enough to serve at Michelin star restaurant. And everyone said, okay, keep your day job, you know. And then I said, we're going to grow apples in northern Sweden. And then they were ready to commit me, I think, you know, padded cell and all that. But, you know, the best way to get me to do something is to tell me it's impossible, because I just become an irate guy, you know, ornery. So I started researching, because everyone told me you can't grow apples up there, it's too cold, blah, blah, blah. And I started researching, and I sort of started looking at other parts of the world that might have an apple growing tradition on these latitudes. And, you know, sure enough, there are plenty of cold climate traditions growing fruit. Russia, Finland, northern US, southern Canada, all these places. So we realized that this project would be much, much longer in scope than any regular entrepreneurial, you know, effort. It's not 3 years or 5 years. It just becomes really quick. It just becomes a decade, and then it becomes 50 years, and then you go, a century. And in wine, location is key. So wine is entirely location-based, and the value of a wine is designated by the place it grows in. Not only does it take its character from the place it grows in, it is actually something that decides its value. So there are vineyards in the world where they make a small amount of Burgundy that's exceptionally expensive because that terroir is considered the best. So if you want to make wine and you want to stay in the game, you have to grow your own fruit, right? So I started researching growing apples on this latitude. And we started out by planting a small trial orchards even further north from here, like 100K north of here, with a good friend of mine. And then 2 years later, in 2016, we decided to plant a whole hectare of apples, just close to town. So there's a large agricultural research station out here. We planted a hectare, and it turned out that there were plenty of apple varieties and plenty of rootstocks. There were plenty of possible cultivars to actually grow apples commercially at this latitude. It was not a problem. But again, because apple growing in Sweden and in Europe in general has turned into this wholesale, high volume, irrigated, push as much volume out of a hectare as possible for the food industry, we have forgotten very quickly that there are many, many apple varieties out there. So we put up a trial orchard, and then we did a major grant application to the European Union. And now, last year and this year, we are establishing 10 hectares in the north of Sweden in collaboration with farmers of different kinds, you know, established milk farmers who want to diversify, young farmers who want to try something new. So, you know, a little over 20 farmers, and the northernmost orchard is actually like 400, 500 kilometers north of here. And so this has turned into the really long-term project here. And I've maintained over the years when we did these trials that there is a certain terroir up here, and that was very much a qualified guess, you know, because I have no idea, nobody knows. But then last year we actually harvested both the trial orchards, and we're now making, only 10 years in, which is a short time in the wine business, we're basically a baby. We're now making the first batch of ice cider from our own terroir. And it is proving to be very much the next step. It is very different, and it's very different in a good way, and it has very much its own identity. And we've always been very, very honest and clear about the fact that we are, at this point, a negociant, if you will. I mean, we buy our apples, we buy them from fantastic growers, we co-own orchards in the South. But as far as terroir goes, they showcase Swedish apples really well. But the next step, as you say, is to build the terroir up here. And the long-term goal and the short-term goal is to have a new wine region up here based on apples with its own appellation that clearly focuses on ice cider. So in this grower cluster that we're now building, we're trying to also encourage the growers to, you know, do some value enhancement of their own and become winemakers or cider makers if they want to. So they're not exclusive to us. And so this has become the real legacy, I think, of Brännland Cider. And early on, when I realized that the apples up here there weren't enough apples up here in the gardens to make ice cider, because ice cider also takes about 4 times the raw material as a regular cider does. So one of these bottles has like 4 kilos of apples in it to get to the concentration. And so we decided early on to say, okay, because nobody was doing anything ambitious with Swedish apples. And I was told that it was impossible to ferment them even, for some reason. And so we decided very consciously to start with, you know, the well-known fruit from the apple growing area in Sweden called the Apple Kingdom, which is way down south, to see if something exceptional could be made with these apples that were sort of standardized. And we realized, so now for 10 years we've been practicing our winemaking skills on these exceptional apples from the south, and now we're getting access to our own fruit up here, and it is very much the next step. And we were at the cider yesterday, and you actually tasted it. So what did you think of the Västerbotten? I mean, yeah, that might be a given answer, but I mean, what's your thought on the difference between what we do now, which we're very proud of, and that?
One thing I was, we talked a nice bit about dessert wine.
Yeah.
I like to sometimes set aside the associations people will have with that. One thing that I think is really distinct, especially the ice cider you make, is the beautiful acidity.
Yeah.
Dessert wine, pudding wine, etc. People can think in a certain way about it. They can put it in a little bit of a box.
Yeah.
I think back here as well then of dinners we've done, wonderful chefs. Remember one where the main course was duck, and I paired one of your ice ciders with it. You're not saying it has to purely fit into that dessert-like role. And the way that the things we tasted yesterday and you have coming up, I mean, you'll be able to summarize better than I, but on what people can expect in the coming years in the liquid itself is always fascinating. When you take something like your Belle de Boskop, I've always been amazed with that, how much actual taste comes through almost purely on the aftertaste, which is quite surreal. You know, you hold this liquid in your mouth to explore it and get to know it, but then it's only when actually you swallow that it opens up this whole other thing. And the different elements we tasted yesterday really seem to be starting to get their own sense of character. The Västerbotten, it seemed a really lovely balance between the different characters of things you made in the past, to be honest, in some ways. The texture it had was fascinating, and the form to the fruit was really distinct. It was really interesting to taste and see the difference it held. Something like the apple ice as well, which again for me is a bit of a different territory to some of your past bottlings, but really starting to stand out on its own, specifically as its character. I mean, and again, very different from the Belle de Boskop.
I mean, so that's one of the things that we've explored in the past few years, as we decided to become ice cider makers exclusively, is like, how can we make sweet wine that's also, if you will, utilitarian in other situations than just dessert. So we now make lighter sweet wines that are broader in their application and just enjoyable as something you can drink on a summer's day, as well as what we usually perhaps will associate with heavier sweet wines, which is the winter season and the fall season. I mean, we've been influenced, of course, by German winemakers in the sense that, and people don't know this about German winemaking. We think about it as this very, they're Germans. It's all straight and boxes and stuff. But actually, the German way of winemaking is really poetic in the sense that several different wines can come out of the same vineyard depending on the year. So they pick the grapes, and they don't decide until after exactly what it's going to become. So they actually let each vineyard have its own expression, which is why it can be confusing to a consumer, because one year a vineyard can produce a Spätlese and another year it produces a dry Riesling. Whereas in other winemaking areas, it's a lot more about you pick the grapes and you make the wine. So we've been influenced by that, which also gives us the freedom to let each fermentation do its thing and then look at what wine it is. And yeah, that's been one of the hardest or most challenging lessons for someone who comes in from more of a normal industry where you decide on things and it just, this is what it is. And you have to sort of turn that around and go, no, don't decide what it is now. We have certain goals in fermentation, but we try to ignore them to some extent. Like, and then when we're done and the fermentations are done, we then look at the wine to see what is this, what does it want to do, and it sounds pretentious and it sounds artistic, and to some extent it is, but it's also true. So yeah, that's I think, and that's the choice to work with fruit from somewhere else to begin with was not. I mean, naturally we would have planted the orchards first and then made ice cider as those orchards grew. But there is an advantage of having learned the craft first and make a good wine with the material at hand to then be able to take care of the expression once it comes out of our orchards. Because now we've sort of internalized this process of making wine where we can actually let them be what they are instead of trying to coax them into something they're not.
One of the things that I think you were really wonderfully making happen, and I'm interested to ask how much there's intention behind this, how much it's just by virtue of manner of working and working in that way. And the Wasserboten, I think, is a really good example, is you are allowing ice cider to move purely beyond a kind of winter window as far as the fit for drinking. Yeah. That's what I thought with the Wasserboten yesterday as well. It really, the sort of springtime, the autumn time, I can really start to see the different roles. The weighty fullness of the Belle de Boskop in the middle of winter is gorgeous. Yeah. The apple ice, you are talking bright warm days. Yeah. And that's, in some senses, a bit new territory for ice cider. But that also fits with this approach, I think, that you are sort of formulating a form of it. It's not purely and entirely ruled by the nature of Canadian ice cider making. No. And yeah.
No, and I mean, I respect those people hugely, but because of where we are and the people that we work with, our ice cider has really gone off on its own tangent, I think. And I really haven't had any Canadians taste it, so that would be really interesting. We should set up a parallel tasting with some Canadian.
Let's talk about food pairing as well, because that's what I deal with a lot. And I can say the acidity that your ice cider has, the balance, which you talked wonderfully about, is what lends it to that. But how do you like to drink it?
I mean, me personally, to the extent that I drink my own product, which is more and more seldom, I really use it as a meditative wine. So somebody from a Swedish wine magazine asked me a few years ago what the best pairing is for the barrique, the barrel-aged cider, and I said a comfortable chair, a sleeping gun dog, an open fire, and possibly a cigar. So that's a nice pairing. But also I think savory pairings are becoming really interesting. There's this tradition in Sauternes where you have a bottle of sweet wine with your Sunday chicken. And I learned about that in Bordeaux a couple of years ago. I had no idea. And so we've actually paired the ice ciders quite a few times with guinea fowl and duck. And it works really well because the sweetness and the acidity of the ice cider plays well with the fattiness and the creamy sauces and all those things that come with a Sunday roast.
And the fruitful body, I say, duck is always one of my absolute favorites. You say that acid cutting through the fat, and then those fruitful tones that work so well with game. And I like, again, if you're also obviously in the dessert role, you push slightly towards that meditative side as well. It can be the after dinner. But I do like as well the small glasses of some of your lighter creations in summer and an afternoon. When you're talking more floral notes, particularly warm days in early spring, you get into some really sumptuous territory.
Terrassenwein, the Germans call it, like balcony wine. Really nice. It's a nice term that I try to use as often as I can. And we are seeing, we're moving into also an area, like you said, like an after dinner thing where we used to drink hard liquor like cognac or Armagnac. And as I get older, I can't have as much hard liquor anymore. So now I use the long-aged ice ciders as an avec after dinner instead of, pouring a full measure of whiskey.
And I know for you the whole nature of Brännland is an ever-evolving kind of exploratory thing. And same for me, the fascination with cider, the discovery element is so fundamental to it.